Okay, so let's go back to San Jacinto and the capture of Santa Ana at San Jacinto. As I said earlier, Santa Ana only cares about Santa Ana, and he wants to save his own skin. He's terrified that the Texans are going to execute him, and so what happens is he cuts a deal. There's a public treaty and a private treaty. So Santa Anna, remember, and this is significant, he's both the president of Mexico and the head of the Mexican army, right? So for the time being, anyway, until remember, it takes there's no roads, there's no cars, there's no trains. It takes forever for the news of the loss of Texas, for instance, to get down to Mexico. It probably didn't get down to Mexico for like 6 weeks. And so at this for a period anyway, Santa Anna is the legal head of the Mexican government. And so there's a public treaty that's signed, which doesn't really say much, but there's also a secret treaty that's signed, and this is much more important. And what I'll test you on is the secret treaty that's signed between Santa Anna and the victorious Texans. Okay, so the public one is just kind of blah blah blah, but the real action was the secret treaty that Santa Anna signed. And here's why it was secret. Because in this secret agreement, Santa Anna agreed to recognize Texas as an independent nation on his own authority as president of Mexico, on the condition that he was released, that he wasn't executed, that he was allowed to go back to Mexico. So in secret, Santa Anna agrees that Texas, yes, is an independent nation on the condition that he's released and that he's able to go free. This is very important because once the Mexican government gets wind of this, they reject this treaty completely. They say that Santa Anna had signed the treaty under duress because he was a prisoner. And in Mexico, what you have is this feeling for about 10 years that Texas has to be reconquered. That Texas has to be brought back into the Mexican nation. So it's called the Reconquista. The Mexicans don't agree on anything in the period between 1836 and 1845. But the one thing that all Mexicans agree is that Texas is a rogue part of Mexico. The Mexican government, after they get wind of the Santa Anna Treaty, they void it. And Mexico will not recognize the independence of Texas. Sure, they had lost to San Jacinto, but the Mexican government still claimed Texas as part of Mexico. What happens is that in 1845, and again, we're jumping ahead for a second, but in 1845, Texas becomes part of the United States. And once Texas becomes part of the United States, it's gone forever. There's no way that Mexico will ever get Texas back because the United States is far too strong. And the United States is just not going to let that happen. And Mexico is quite furious when Texas is annexed into the United States as a state. But in that period between 36 and 45, when you have this pretty weak Republic of Texas, you had many people in Mexico still hoping against hope that somehow the Mexican army, the Mexican government could get its act together in such a way that they could march back into Texas and that they could retake it for Mexico. Okay, so that's why Santa Anna's recognition of Texas as an independent nation was completely rejected by the Mexican government. Once they got a hold of it, they say that Santa Anna is a prisoner, that he's not president anymore. But more importantly, the Mexican government says we do not recognize the independence of Texas. We still think that Texas is part of Mexico. And again, it's not until Texas becomes part of the U.S. that Mexico realizes the reality that Texas is gone forever. And so the secret treaty comes to nothing. Santa Anna, actually, the Texas government decides to get him out of Texas. It was very dangerous for him there because, of course, people were so enraged by his behavior. And he was kept kind of in a jail cell, and then he was put on a boat, I think a U.S. naval boat, and he was sent to Washington, D.C. And basically what the Texans are doing is like, okay, let's get this guy out of our hair. Let's send him to Washington, D.C. Let's let the United States deal with this guy. So when he's in Washington, D.C., he meets with Andrew Jackson. He talks about maybe negotiating a peace between Mexico and Texas, which again the Mexican government wants nothing to do with. And finally, the U.S. government sails Santa Anna on a U.S. Navy vessel back to Veracruz, Mexico. And he returns home about a year after the Texas Revolution in February of 1837. To be honest with you, Santa Anna was probably not in a big hurry to get back to Mexico. He'd completely blown things at Texas. But so it takes him about a year to get back to Mexico. And believe it or not, this isn't the last we've heard of Santa Anna. Santa Anna will be president of Mexico at least a couple of more times. And it's going to be Santa Anna who leads the Mexican army against the U.S. Army during the Mexican-American War that goes on from 1846 to 1848. And once again, he does a horrible job and helps lose the war for the Mexican government and the Mexican people. So the nightmare of Santa Anna is not over for the Mexican people. Anyway, but he's out of Texas and he's back to Mexico by 1836. Now, and as I said before, but I'll repeat, the Mexican government's official stance was that Texas was still part of Mexico, and then the Mexican government and the Texas government had this argument about the boundary, the southern boundary of the Republic of Texas. The Republic of Texas claimed that the southern boundary was the Rio Grande River, but the Mexican government said no, completely false. First of all, we don't recognize your independent country, but even if you were, the traditional and the historic boundary of the province of Texas during both the Spanish period and the Mexican period was always the Nueces River, never the Rio Grande. So this becomes a matter of dispute, and it's not going to be settled, the southern border of Texas, until the Mexican-American War, after Texas becomes part of the United States. Okay. You know what, I'm going to stop there and start another podcast.